One of the key trends in which we are living as a Christian church is the reality of the persecuted church. You may not be undergoing persecution where you live, but it is a reality for many Christians in many different parts of the world in which we find the underground church. Today, we'll tell the story of one of the key voices from the persecuted church that has seen the 21st century. My name is Dennis Gitonga, and I'm here to present to you Missionary Stories. Welcome. Richard Wurmbrand was born to his Jewish parents in Romania in the year 1909 on the 24th of March. Being a Romanian Jew, Richard grew to encounter the rise of the communist regime. In the year 1938, Richard and his wife, Sabina Oster, gave their lives to Christ after encountering the gospel. Sometime later, he would become a Lutheran pastor. In the year 1945, Richard, together with about 4,000 other religious leaders, gathered for a congress in which the communist regime sought to get their allegiance. In that very meeting, Richard Wurmbrand outrightly and outspokenly resisted and insisted that Christianity and communism were not compatible. His problems began. Together with many other Christians, Richard suffered persecution and torture for their faith. At a time when it was not popular and it was not even safe for a Christian to confess their faith, Richard, his wife, and many other Christians decided that they were going to remain firm and fixed on Christ, regardless of what was going to face them. Now, during this day in which he made that outright rejection of the proposal that communism and Christianity should work together, his wife Sabina was the greatest motivation. The story goes that when this was happening and many of the religious leaders were giving their hands or signing or sealing their commitment to work with the communism government, Richard's wife was not happy about it, and neither was Richard. And seated there, they wrestled with the thought of what it would mean for them to speak against what every other person was speaking. Would they say yes or would they say no? Sabina encouraged her husband and told him, to stand up for what he believed. And right there, Richard sensitively told his wife, "You know what this means, Sabina." In other words, he was saying he would likely be arrested and eventually probably killed because of refusing to toe the line. The words of Sabina were piercing, and I believe they would be piercing to you today as well. Sabina told her husband, "I would rather not have a husband than have one who is a coward." And with those words, it was sealed. Richard stood and made his firm statement that Christianity and communism could not be compatible. On 29th of February 1948, Richard was arrested arrested for the many things that he was doing against the communism beliefs. One of them is that he was constantly evangelizing Russian and German troops, as well as the Jews, which was illegal. This was a ministry that he was doing underground. Richard and his counterparts would distribute Bibles, the gospel especially, in the disguise of communist propaganda. He would go visiting them in the barracks and where they would be camped just to get to share the gospel with them. Now, unfortunately, this led him to be arrested. He was later released and he continued his underground work with the rest of the people he was working with. However, in 1959, Richard was rearrested. Now, the sad thing about this rearresting was that it was instigated by a betrayal from one of his associates in the ministry. Now, when he finally got to that moment of arrest, it was on a Sunday when he was going to the service, and he had decided to send his family ahead of him, and then he would be walking and then get to have some engagements he was having and then join them in the service. This, unfortunately, was the marked day for his arrest. A vehicle stood next to him, and before he could tell, a mask was on his face. And for miles, they drove without knowing where they were going. Now, Richard had made a practice, a very nice habit that probably would challenge us today, to memorize a scripture for each day of the year. And his scriptures were centered on the area of fear. So he had memorized 366 verses on fear from the scripture. Now, on this particular day in which he was arrested, the verse that he was to recite was the book of Psalm, chapter 56 and verse 3. And it says, "What time I am afraid, I will trust in thee." That rang in his mind even as he was being driven to the prison. Now, the practice once you were arrested in those days was that you would need to betray some other Christians or expose them. But also, they would seek a way to force you to renounce your faith. And constantly, they got Richard and tried to convince him to tell on one of his other brethren, to which he constantly and continually refused. And therefore, they would take him back into the cells. There were Christians who would actually tell on their other believers, and Richard suffered one of that because that's why he was in prison for the first time, or for the same reason. But Richard refused to tell on any of them. Now, for 14 years, Richard was in prison, being tortured, suffering with other Christians that were with him. During those days, of course, there was a lot happening in the prisons. They would get sick. Some of them maybe would die in prison because of those diseases or because of extreme torture. And he would be there encouraging them, calling them to press on in spite of the suffering that they were going through. Now, 3 of these 14 years in prison were spent in solitary confinement. Now, you may not be familiar with that, but let me give you a glimpse into it. Solitary confinement was a situation where they would be put in an underground cell, 30 feet underground, without any source of light, not natural light and not artificial light. In darkness, they would be from time to time tortured. One of the things that would happen in solitary confinement is that the communist propaganda would be brought to them and they would be made to listen to it, whether they liked it or not, with hopefully the attempt or the desire to brainwash them and have them coming from there speaking communism and convinced of it. Richard, by the grace of God, endured that, having listened to it. But in solitary confinement also, the chances of you losing your sanity were high. Imagine yourself today being locked up for 3 years in a very dark cell underground, not meeting people, not listening to anything that you'd love, just listening to these things that you don't want to. Now, Richard was enabled by God to work on this. He would work on his sermons, compose sermons, and then preach them to an imaginary audience. Just get that. Compose sermons and preach them to an imaginary audience, just to keep his sanity. During that time, the scriptures he had memorized were ministering to him. The many things that he would think about from scripture continued to minister to him. And 3 years later, when he was brought from there, he was still sane and sober. But you can imagine how tough that must have been. In fact, one of the practices he also engaged in was summarizing those sermons in rhymes, such that it would be possible for him to just give a whole sermon based on a rhyme that he had worked on. Now, Richard was later ransomed from prison, and he and his wife relocated to the US, from which they founded a ministry called Jesus for the Communist World. That was in the year 1967. Sometime later, this ministry was renamed not Tortured, but Voice of the Martyrs. Now, Voice of the Martyrs is involved in supporting persecuted believers across the world, smuggling Bibles into the restricted areas where Christian witness is not allowed, but also they encourage Western believers or Christians. Now, the story of Richard Wurmbrand is told in his book, Tortured for Christ. Also, there is a movie that was produced by the Voice of the Martyrs called Tortured for Christ, and it gives a very good glimpse into what happened to this guy. You may not be suffering like the Christians in those areas that Richard ministers to, or the late Richard ministered to, and that Voice of the Martyrs ministers to today. But as we look at these dates that I'm mentioning, they are dates that are not too far off for us to relate with. We are not talking about the 1600s. We are not talking about the 15th century. No. We are talking about something that has just happened in the recent past. The 1930s, the 1940s. In fact, Richard did not die so long ago. And so his story lives in our season, in our times. Are you living your life for Christ in full? Would you live for him under such intense persecution? How much would you withstand as far as your faith is concerned, as far as torture is concerned, as far as suffering is concerned? What testimony do you have of having endured? It is so easy for us to give up on the very first set of persecution that we encounter. But Richard and his counterparts, many of them, went through what many would call hell, for lack of a better word, and yet they stood firm. I'd like you to take a look at that movie, Tortured for Christ by the Voice of the Martyrs. They try as much as possible to present the experiences of the prisoners of faith that were there. Maybe, just maybe, that could encourage your faith in your season. And seeing that most of us are not in the persecuted world, perhaps this is a time to be thankful to God, but also to think about the persecuted church and remember them in your prayers. Thank you so much for joining us today for Missionary Stories. See you next time.